Hi guys and welcome back, it's Jason, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about the exposure triangle. And have you ever wondered what people mean when they say shutter speed? Today we're going to talk about that and see if we can make it a little clearer. In the previous couple of videos, we've talked about exposure, and when it comes to photography, it's all about the light. We've talked about the exposure triangle, and in the previous video, we talked about one part of the exposure triangle, aperture. In this video, we're going to talk about another part of the three-legged stool, another leg, which is the shutter speed and what shutter speed does when it comes to creating a perfectly exposed photo and creating the photo that you want to make. In the last video, we talked about aperture and the opening in your camera lens that allows more or less light into your actual camera to make its way to the sensor. Between the opening of your lens and the actual sensor is a thing called the shutter. Now the shutter basically is like a set of curtains on a window. They open and they close. If you were standing in front of your window and someone was looking in or there was light shining in, you open the curtains for a short period of time and a little bit of light, or someone standing out there looking at you could only see you for a short period of time. If you open them for a long period of time, more light would land on you and more light, a person outside could see you for a longer period of time. Essentially, that's what your shutter does. It opens and closes those curtains, and it allows more or less light to hit your sensor. Another thing that affects is the capture of motion, the amount of blur that is in your picture. In some cases you want the blur, in other cases you do not want the blur, and shutter speed allows you to control that blur in your photos. Most modern cameras measure shutter speed in fractions of a second. So when you see 1/1000th of a second or 1/50th of a second, that is a measurement of how long and how fast your shutter speed is. Now, in some cases, you will want a much longer shutter speed. For example, if you're doing astrophotography or you want to get that nice creamy motion blur when you're taking the picture of a waterfall or the sea or something along those lines, you're going to want a lot longer shutter speeds, 1, 5, 10, 20, 30 seconds when it comes to the actual length of your shutter speed being open and allowing more light into your sensor. Obviously, when you're doing something like astrophotography, you want to let in as much light as you possibly can. Now, that will be indicated on most cameras by a parentheses symbol beside the number, like 2 seconds. So when you're talking about a very fast shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, you're looking to freeze motion. So a lot of sports or concerts or anything like that, you're going to want a very fast shutter speed so that you actually freeze that motion and capture very little motion blur. So what you can do, you can use these different shutter speeds to actually be creative with your photo and get the actual photo that you want. Now, one thing you have to take into account when you're using your shutter speed, if you're shooting handheld, one of the general rules is, for example, say you're using a 50mm lens. You should not drop your shutter speed if you're shooting handheld below 1/50th of a second. So you see what I did there, 50mm lens, 1/50th of a second. Because when you start slowing down the shutter slower than that, you're going to factor in some kind of handshake, and that will create blur that you don't want. That's not the blur that you're looking for. So now a lot of modern lenses will have some kind of image stabilization, maybe even your camera does, but that's a general rule to keep in your mind, and depending on the photo that you're taking, that will factor into the equation that you're creating when making a photo. When using a very slow shutter, one thing that I always recommend is have your camera still. So the best way to do that is to use a quality tripod, something that keeps your camera very still, very stable, And because you're going to have the camera shutter open for a long time, and if it's not stable, you're going to get a lot of unwanted blur. So for example, if you were again taking a picture of the stars, trying to capture the Milky Way, your camera lens is going to be open for 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds, depending on the photo that you're looking to capture. And if the camera is not stable, everything is going to be blurry. Your stars are going to be dancing all over the place. And that's not what you want. So for example, I use a three-legged thing, a branded tripod that keeps my camera stable. I'm actually using it right now to capture this video. So that's something that you should factor in when you're planning on taking long exposure photos, stars, waterfalls, the sea, anything that keeps your shutter open for a long period of time. Make sure that your camera is good and stable. So some basic rules when it comes to shutter speed and how you think about shutter speed. How fast is the subject? How stable is your camera? How much are you zoomed in, like the distance to your subject, because that can factor in on shake as well. So again, how stable is your camera? You'll notice that when you zoom in with your camera, every little shake becomes more amplified because of the distance. And again, distance to the subject, that can create movement and blur. So factor those things in when you're calculating how you want to use your shutter speed. And over time, your brain becomes more accustomed to adjusting all this information more quickly, and you will just get used to being able to do it automatically. In the previous two videos, we talked about exposure and aperture. Here today, we talked about shutter speed. Coming up next, I will be talking about ISO. That will be in the next video. You will be able to see links for the previous two videos down below. And while you're down there, please don't hesitate to subscribe and hit the bell to let you know when I make my next video and you can learn all about ISO. I thank you for being here, and I'll see you again next time.